Hi, and welcome back to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the authors that are bringing them to you. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight we are bringing in a ton of stuff to add to that to-be-read pile. So let's see who's bringing it all in the door. So, Frank, you're up first.
Hi, my name is Frank W. Butterfield, and I write gay mystery and romance, both historical fiction and contemporary. And I'm here to talk about a couple of books in two different series that are interconnected to each other. And I can't wait to find out what everybody else has to say. And thanks for having me here.
Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith R. DeCandido. I am, as always, happy to be here. I've written about 60 novels, 100 short stories, 50 comic books, and more nonfiction that I'm comfortable counting. Tonight, I am specifically going to be discussing 3 new releases, which are all anthologies, 2 of which I co-edited, and all 3 of which I have stories in.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kim Fielding. I'm happy to be here. And tonight I'm going to be talking primarily about I think it's my 35th novel. I'm sorry to say I've lost track, which is kind of sad. And it's called Crow's Fate. And I write all the things. I write science fiction, fantasy, horror, and gay romance.
Joshua?
Hello, my name is Joshua Palmatier. I write epic fantasy for DAW. You can find all my first trilogy all in one volume called The Throne of Amancore, and my most recent trilogy starts with the Shattering the Leg. I'm here, though, to talk about my small press and the new releases from the small press. The small press is called Zombies Need Brains, and we have 1 compilation anthology that came out last week. And we have 4 new themed anthologies that are coming out next week. So lots of things going on with our small press.
And Wally.
I'm Wally Quigley. I am here to talk about my first novel, and I'm only slightly intimidated by everyone with 35 different publications or whatever. But I published an anthology last year. And I am the architect behind the magazine Double Feature, which is our flagship publication from my own company, Ascendant Publishing. The novel I'm here for is called The Ascendant as well. So happy to be here amongst such esteemed authors.
Nothing to be intimidated about. We all started somewhere.
Right.
Yeah, Keith was hatched. It's okay. All right. So, Frank, why don't we go ahead and get started? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the world we're going to be diving into with these couple of interconnected novels?
Well, it has to do with wine, which I don't know anything about, but I've learned a lot about recently. The first novel, which is complete and it has been out for about 6 or 5 weeks, is called The Vicious Vintner. And the interconnected novel that is in another time, but has a lot of connections back and forth, will be coming out in a couple of weeks. Should be out by the time this goes to air. And that book is called Dancing in the Moonlight. The basic theme here is that my primary characters end up buying a couple of wineries, one in Burgundy and one in Sonoma. And this photograph is Sonoma, looking at the North Bay. And then there's all sorts of interconnectedness to things in the past and to other people. And it turns out to be kind of a big surprise as to what happens and how they get to where they go. But more than anything, this book is a transition book for me in this series that it was written in called the Nick Williams Mysteries. This is number 39 in that series. And this is the end of their kind of like, they're becoming senior citizens essentially, and they're moving into their what's going to be what will be more or less their Murder, She Wrote phase, which will kind of correlate, and it is the same time period. They're the same age as Angela Lansbury, so they'll be doing kind of Murder, She Wrote things through the 80s. And so this book takes us from 73 to 83, and is a big kind of epic story that crosses a lot of time elements and things that happen in that time period. The second book is just more of that, but going deeper and learning more about what we didn't find out in the first book. So I'll leave it there.
All right, Keith. So let's jump through the different anthologies you've got going on.
Well, two of them have been released, and the third will be released later this year. The first is Double Trouble, God, it's glaring. Double Trouble, an anthology of two-fisted team-ups, which is the second anthology put out by the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers. It was co-edited by myself and Jonathan Mayberry, who is the president of the IAMTW and also a great author in his own right, and also an excellent anthologist. I've also put a lot of anthologies together over the years. I've done over 20 anthologies. And this one, the theme of this one is teaming up of classic characters. And classic characters is a fancy way of saying characters who are in the public domain, which means we don't have to pay for their rights. But it's taking a whole bunch of people who have experience in writing other characters in various media tie-in worlds, Star Trek, Marvel, Supernatural, what have you, and taking some classic old characters and putting them together. Things like, for example, Kevin J. Anderson put together Captain Nemo with Frankenstein's monster. David Mack paired Shakespeare's Prospero with Cervantes' Don Quixote. Stuff like that. One of my favorites was Delilah Dawson, who put together Lydia Bennet from Jane Austen with Lord Ruthven, who was a vampire created by John Polidori. So, all sorts of fun little mashups like that. My own story puts together Igoganoya, who is a Yoruba goddess, with the protagonist from H. Rider Haggard's novel She. So they're both immortal women who kick a certain amount of butt. And then the second one is a Sherlock Holmes anthology called Cases by Candlelight, Volume 2, which is 4 short stories by myself, Christopher D. Abbott, Michael Jan Friedman, and Aaron Rosenberg, which are all stories about the great detective himself. I did a story called The Thick Blue Line, in which Holmes is tasked with finding out what is wrong with one of the chief superintendents of Scotland Yard. And then finally, I have, and this is going to look really weird on the thing, the 4 whatevers of the apocalypse, or the 4 somethings of the apocalypse, or, also, but that's, this will be the inaugural publication from Whisperwood, which is the very small press that my wife, Ren Sims, and I have put together because we're insane. And Joshua's laughing because, of course, he's done the same thing, so he knows. The first thing we're doing is basically alternative takes on the End of the World Quartet. Instead of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, we have the 4 librarians of the apocalypse, the 4 lawyers of the apocalypse, the 4 PTA moms of the apocalypse, the 4 lunch ladies of the apocalypse, the 4 development executives of the apocalypse, the 4 customer service representatives of the apocalypse, the 4 cats of the apocalypse, because of course there must be cats, and so on. And my own story is entitled "What Do You Want From Me? I'm Old," and it's about the 4 septuagenarians of the apocalypse.
All right, Kim, what are you bringing to us?
So my book is called Crow's Fate. I love this cover, which I like. The nice thing about covers is I can pet them, and I didn't make it, so it's not like I'm boasting. The artist did it, and I think it's beautiful. So it is the first book in a Shared World series. So there are 16 books that are coming out. The name of the series is The Carnival of Mysteries. So 16 different authors, and what they all have in common is there's a magical carnival that appears as an element somewhere in the story. So I feel a little stressed in that mine is the first release in all of this. So I feel like I'm kind of, it's a little it's a lot of pressure. But my book takes place, like Frank's, actually in the 80s, and it's an urban fantasy about a young man in Southern Illinois who gets a really terrible fortune told at this carnival, and then it talks about his adventures as he tries to figure out what he is, because he's probably not quite human, and as he also tries to escape destiny and shape his own fate. And my literary influences as I was writing this were Ray Bradbury, because carnivals, Ray Bradbury seem to go hand in hand, and Sophocles and Walt Whitman. So if you kind of take those 3 together, that's maybe what you'd end up with.
All right, Joshua. Now you got to top Keith in the stack of anthologies.
Yes, anthologies everywhere. So I'll start with the first one, which is essentially it's a compilation of all of the stories that Zombies Need Brains released over the past year in our brand new science fiction and fantasy magazine called ZNB Presents. So just so everybody knows, we're on Patreon. Find us on Patreon because we need subscribers if we're going to keep this going. But here's year one, all in one volume. So ZNB Presents year one. It's edited by me. I'm the only editor for it. And basically, I pick all of the stories out of an open call. So there's no like anchors or anything like that. Just everybody submits and I go through and pick out the stories that I find are the best. So there's no theme. There's stories from pretty much every subgenre of science fiction and fantasy in there. We've got alternate history and it's all over the place. But I feel like you're guaranteed to find some really great stories in there. So ZNB Presents year one. We just started year two. The first story for that one was released on July 1st. And if you sign up for the Patreon and one of the two tiers for the magazine, at the end of the year, you'll get the compilation anthology for free. So there's a little bonus there besides supporting a small press. The other four that I want to talk about, those are all of our usual themed anthologies. And there's four this year because last year was our 10th year of the small press. And I was utterly shocked to make it to year 10. And so we went a little bit overboard and we did 4 anthologies instead of our usual 3. So the first one I'll talk about is called Artifice and Craft. And this one was edited by David B. Coe and Edmund R. Schubert. And basically the theme for this one was arts and crafts, right? Artisan things, except of course they're all imbued with some kind of magic. And so the stories are all involving the magic of that particular item. So, you know, like the standard is you've got the picture of Dorian Gray, right? Where the painting was essentially magic and whatnot. So stories along those lines, except obviously we didn't do paintings necessarily. So lots of different artifacts and crafts used in a magical way in that one. I like the tagline on the top of this one. It says, "Would you kill for your art?" And then it follows up with, "Would it kill for you?" And so that's our first anthology of the 4. The second anthology is called Game On. This is the gaming anthology, obviously. It's edited by Stephen Kotowich and Tony Pye. And this one I think is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically a bunch of short stories about games. So the game is integrated into the story somehow. And obviously it's not any, you know, copyright owned kind of games or anything, but we've got things from basic solitaire all the way up to, you know, RPG and computer animated games and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's all over the map. Zombies likes variety in our anthologies. So lots and lots of variety there for the games. And again, those were the 2 I did not edit. Now we're up to the 2 that I did with a co-editor. So the next one's called Solar Flare. And this one's all about solar punk stories. And we really, the editors are Patricia Bray and myself. And we really, really wanted this one to be hopeful future stories. We did not want downer stories of the future. So all of the stories in here are stories that involve, you know, a hopeful take on our future. So we've solved a lot of our climate problems. We've solved a lot of our other issues. And so Patricia and I kind of wanted to see something a little more hopeful put out there into the world. So solar punk stories that are a little bit more hopeful in the long run. So that's Solar Flare. And then the last one is also pretty self-explanatory about the theme. It's called Dragonesque. And a little appropriate since Tor sort of made this a Dragon Week, unofficially called it Dragon Week. But Dragonesque, the conceit here is that the stories are all told from the dragon's point of view. So they're not just stories that have dragons. They're stories from the dragon's point of view. And so the editors on that one are S.C. Butler and myself. And again, I think there's a lot of variety in terms of not just dragons, but we've got sci-fi stories, we've got fantasy stories, we've got urban fantasy stories. We try to get a lot of variety, as I said. So those are the four that I have to talk about in terms of theme. And then, of course, the magazine compilation.
So, Wally, how about you? What's the setup for your novel?
So I am promoting my first novel, The Ascendant, and it is the first book. Oh, there we go. Keeps. I got it on the blur your background, but it's called The Ascendant, and it's the first book in the Hierophant trilogy. So for my first novel, I wanted to keep my scope really small, and I just kept it to a trilogy. It's about it's a bit of a take on the mad scientist trope / genre, where a biochemist who is afflicted with numerous neuropathologies or whatever, but is still brilliant, decides that he is going to attempt to repair himself when modern medicine can't do what he wants it to do. And in doing so, he sort of accelerates the evolutionary process, but he also sort of condemns himself to being in a comatose state and being in a parallel void type of dimension. So in order to pull himself out of that world, he issues like a distress call to someone he's previously been connected with. And the novel actually follows the person that he calls to come and rescue him. And it's, like I said, it's the start of a trilogy, and I'm pretty excited about it. I wish I had more to talk about. Everybody else has like 5 books. I just have one.
So, looking at the stack of stuff adding to the to be read here, because it's going to cost everybody a bunch of money. But so Keith, I'm gonna start with you on this one. So let's pick a couple of your the stories that you wrote. Give us kind of a little bit of a rundown. Who are we hanging out with? Between the Holmes anthology, the 4 octogenarians of the septuagenarians of the apocalypse. Who are we actually hanging out with here? What's happening?
So, well, with the in the story, what do you want from me? I'm old. It's 4 older people who are hanging out on the bench in front of a bodega in the Bronx every day, which is something the Bronx is where I live. It's something you see in big cities a lot, where there's a bench outside the local deli and there's a bunch of codgers just sitting around on there. And in this case, there's 4 of them. There is one who is always sick. There is one who is allergic to everything, and she is very skinny. There is one who is complaining about everything and always getting into fights. And then there's one other guy who almost never says anything, but he always glares at them whenever they use profanity. And we get to spend time with them over the course of the year, starting when the weather is warm and into the summer and then into the fall and winter. I don't want to say much beyond that, but it's the anthology itself of the 4 thingamabobs of the apocalypse is lots of different takes on it, and some of them really are apocalyptic, that really do involve the end of the world, and some of them are comedic. A lot of them are comedic. Some of them are pretty horrific and icky. Some of them are nasty as hell. I decided to do something that was very small scale and almost elegiac. It's really just about these 4 people who don't have much left in their lives aside from the other 3 people who sit on the bench with them. And it was at least partly a tribute to the 4 people who raised me, who are all now in their 70s, who don't actually spend their time sitting on the bodega outside. But nonetheless, this was at least partly a tribute to them as well. The Holmes story when I was approached by Christopher Abbott to do a home story, I started thinking about what I would want to do given a chance to write. And I thought it would be a really nifty idea to have all the detectives, all the Scotland Yard detectives that Holmes had worked with at various points in Conan Doyle's fiction, get together to hire Holmes to look into a case for them. In this case, their boss, the chief superintendent of detectives, has been acting funny. And they're worried that his eccentric behavior is going to get him fired, at which point the higher-ups at Scotland Yard will replace him with an idiot, because that's what they mostly get in that position. It's a political position more than anything. They've lucked out into the fact that their current chief super is actually very good at the job, and they don't want to lose him. But this is the late 19th century. There is no internal affairs. And investigating other police is just not something that's done. And so Lestrade and Gregson and Bradstreet and Jones and Hopkins and MacDonald all get together and go to Holmes and say, will you find out, see if you can find out what is wrong with Superintendent Nash. And he does. And it leads to a bunch of other things, and stuff happens. I wanted to do something with the various almost interchangeable detectives that Conan Doyle used over the course of his stories. I just thought it would be a nice that was something different, and yet still very much a traditional Holmes story. As for Double Trouble, the team up, both Aisha from Haggard's 1880s novel, she's the ruler of a ancient lost city in deepest, darkest Africa. I had already written her once before in the IAMTW's previous anthology, which was called Turning the Tide. I just did a solo story with her. The one thing I changed from Haggard's original conception is that she is actually a woman of color, because you would expect that from somebody who lived in Africa. Haggard could never have written a story about a black woman who ran a nation in 1888. I am not so constrained, and my feeling is that when Haggard, she was presented, as many 19th century novels were, as the account of an adventure that happened that Haggard found the papers of and therefore put it in the book. And my conceit was that he changed Aisha's skin color to that of a white woman because he knew his audience. And he knew that a Victorian audience would not buy a woman of color in that position. So the story that I wrote for Double Trouble has her, who at this point is known to be the ruler of this nation by the time we reach the 21st century. It is not known that she is immortal. That is a closely guarded secret. But she also spends a lot of time helping African-American businesses and communities and such where she can. Igogonoya is a Yoruba goddess, which is worshipped by a lot of people in West Africa and also in Haiti. And what happens is the story takes place in 2017. And it's really bizarre to me that 2017 is now a period piece, but it sort of is. It's very much of that particular time period. And by that time period, I mean the early days of the Trump administration. And in particular, other various bits of racial violence that happened in 2017. Charlottesville, Ferguson, and so on. And there's an attack on a building in Philadelphia that includes 3 Black-owned businesses, one of which is Aisha's company. And one of the people hurt is somebody who worships the Yoruba pantheon. And so Igogonoya and Aisha basically team up to find out what happened. So you got 2 immortal women who can kick lots of butt, and they do. So it was a chance to do a little treatise on race relations that I hope worked.
So Kim, tell us a little bit more about your carnival world we're diving into.
Sure. I was rereading a lot of Ray Bradbury, like I said, and so I think I felt, I kind of heard his voice whispering to me, and I always loved with Bradbury that sense of, kind of mixed wonder and doom, that kind of magic. And so the concept behind the whole series is that there's this magical carnival, and it can show up just for one day, any time and any place. So in my story, it shows up initially in Southern Illinois in the 1970s, and my main character, Crow Rap, he's not quite 18. He's lives with his grandparents on a really struggling corn farm, and he goes to the carnival with some friends, and he walks into the fortune teller's tent, and actually the fortune teller isn't there, but one of the roustabouts is, and the roustabout, they're kind of kidding around, kind of flirting, and the roustabout says he'll tell Crow's fortune, but then he actually gets a true vision, and it's a really bleak one, and then terrible things happen, and that's all in the first chapter. So then the rest of the book is 10 years later, as Crow has just spent the last 10 years basically wandering around the United States, because anytime he starts caring for somebody, really bad things happen to them. So he's been itinerant, and he's finally getting to the point where he's tired of just letting fate drag him around, and he kind of has a choice to make about which side he's going to be on, I guess. And he ends up refinding this carnival and refinding the roustabout who initially gave him the vision. And the roustabout is from Victorian London, because the fun thing about a magical carnival is you can put your people in there from anywhere. So he's from Victorian London, and so they start traveling together to try and get some answers about who or what Crow is, and about how he can escape this fate. And I love side characters. So in addition to the two of them, there's some really fun side characters. The Fates appear a couple of times in several aspects. And the other thing I really like, I like to travel a lot, and this book he goes back and forth across the country several times, and especially in Midwestern towns. I think the Midwest gets kind of overlooked, especially small towns in the Midwest get overlooked in stories. And I don't live in the Midwest. I live in a small town in California, but I'm from there. And so that kind of sense of that, things can happen even in a small town in Southern Illinois.
So Joshua, give us a little bit of tell us about a couple of your favorite stories.
Okay. I'll start with the compilation of the magazine. Like I said, this one's all over the map in terms of genre and theme and all that kind of stuff. There is no theme, essentially. You see things like the first story in the anthology, actually, called When the Salt Burns Green by Brian Hugenbrook. And it's this one would be a fantasy, but I found it very interesting because the main character is a fae, but she's investigating mysteries and trying to use science to do it, trying not to use magic, because the magic that the fae use in this world is kind of addictive. And so she's trying to stay away from it. But she ends up investigating this murder that was apparently committed by a salt golem. So a golem made out of salt. And so just the combination of the idea of a salt golem, because the murder occurs in a basically a salt mining town. And the fact that you've got this fae that's attempting to solve the mystery with science, and science for obviously that particular world. So not our high tech science, but close to it. Kind of like Terry Pratchett uses science a lot in his Discworld novels and whatnot. So I thought that one was very interesting. And then so obviously a fantasy setting, a fantasy feel to that. And then you contrast it with something like the story In This Corner of the Universe, which was written by Maria Z. Medina. That one's sci-fi, set in space, and it's about this young girl who doesn't really fit in, but what happens on one of her school field trips is that she's a little bit impulsive, and she ends up contacting or at least touching one of these aliens that show up like once every like 7 years or something like that. And so she ends up forming this bond with these aliens. And so the story kind of skips, every 7 years or whatever, as she grows up and her trying to fit into society and dealing with this bond that she's made with these aliens. And so, heavy sci-fi, not hard sci-fi, but certainly more sci-fi than the Gollum story. And so that's one of the things I liked about the magazine, is that we've been doing the themes for 10 years. And I said, there are a lot of stories that I have to pass up in the themed anthologies that I think are really, really good. But I can't use them because they're not on theme. So the magazine gave me an opportunity to buy stories that don't fit a theme, but are still really, really good stories. So that's essentially what I did with this first year of the magazine. So as for the other anthologies, we'll start with the ones that I actually edited, because I'm a little more familiar with the stories from those. But for Solar Flare, we got a lot of really good stories in this one. But just to give you a little sense of the flavor or whatnot, the first story in the anthology is called Dust Bowl Detective by David Keener. And basically it's what it sounds like. There's the climate crisis is essentially still going on, but we've come up with some ways to combat it. And so the main character is investigating the theft of some material from a train. So it's kind of like a Western with a train heist going on in it. And but one of the things that was taken was this rare metal. And so he's trying to figure out like why were they after this rare metal? And it turns out that the rare metal is something that they're using to help combat the climate change. So it's got, again, a nice variety of stories. That's just a little taste. We've got like one of the stories has like dirigibles essentially, but the dirigibles are all farms. So they fly around and they land on at different towns and whatnot. And then, basically it's a giant farmer's market and whatnot. So that one has a cat in it, just to bring in that cat. There must always be a cat somewhere, as Keith said. So that story is all about a cat as well. It's called Hemingway versus the Storm. And it's by Christopher R. Muscato. I don't know why I'm picking all of the names that I'm totally unaware of how they're actually pronounced. I can't pick the easy ones like Randall. But anyway, and then a Dragon-esque. Obviously, lots of point of view dragon stories in this one. But again, there's we like the variety. So you've got the story Slay by Esther Friesner. She wrote a story called Slay, and it's about a young dragon that doesn't identify as a dragon, identifies as a unicorn. And so it's an urban fantasy story, and really, really good story. And that's one of the reasons it's the lead off in the anthology. So that one was called Slay. But then, we've got the story Sheep Rarely Wear Gold, by Mike Jack Stombos, and that one's sci-fi, like pretty heavy-duty sci-fi as well. And in that case, it's a dragon that's been imprisoned on this planet with some alien creatures on it. So imprisoned by the aliens, and the humans show up, and the dragon is attempting to use the humans to escape his prison. So the dragon's using the humans in that one. So nice little twist, I think, and really good in terms of interpreting a dragon in a sci-fi setting. I think it was a really good interpretation. So the other two, the Artifice and Craft and the Game On anthologies, obviously I've read the stories because I'm the publisher and I read everything before I put it out. But not as familiar with the stories in this one. For Artifice and Craft, though, one of the stories that really impressed me was it's called Isabel in Red Lake. And again, it's a name I'm probably going to mispronounce, but it's Jelena Donato. So Isabel in Red Lake. And that one actually, I joked about not doing all paintings, but that one's actually about painting. It's about a young girl who's trying to escape the restrictions of her world, which are that girls can't be painters. It has to be all boys and men. And so she starts off the story by trying to impersonate a boy going to the basically the art college and attempting to get in as a boy and whatnot and pass the tests and whatnot to get in. So it starts off there, but it goes horribly wrong, and then the story develops from there. So that's probably the first 2 pages of this story there for the summary. But again, a lot of really cool uses of art in this anthology. We've got ones that are about like plays, like a play that goes wrong. We've got one about clockworks, making clocks like the old-fashioned gears and whatnot. We've got one about painting teacups and having that affect your dreams and whatnot. So it's all over the place, which again I like. And then we've got Game On, all about games. Different kinds of games, of course. The one that I mentioned earlier that's about solitaire, that one I thought was really cool. There we are. It's called Solitaire for 3, which seems contradictory, but it makes sense when you read the story. That was by James Allen Gardner. And it's really cool. Obviously, it's about a magic deck. And if you play solitaire with it, magic things happen, and not necessarily in a good way. I'll let you guys discover why it's called Solitaire for 3 by reading the story. But solitaire there, and then the Random Access Memory by Eric Choi. That one I thought was really, really cool because it's about the game is the gambling, like slot machines, and kind of like how you can get addicted to them. But in this case, when you play the game, it affects your memory. So that's why it's called Random Access Memory and stuff. So again, I wish we could go through all of the stories because obviously we liked them all. But those are some of the highlights, I think, from those anthologies. So definitely go check them all out.
So, Wally, let's dive a little bit deeper into who we're hanging out with in your book.
Sure. So I know I mentioned earlier that it was the events of the novel get kicked off by this scientist who's ostensibly trying to kind of fix a couple of his maladies that he's had to deal with for majority of his life, but the action of the novel actually follows the person he calls out to, who he's bonded with through, I don't want to spoil the novel or anything like that, but her name is Magdalena, and it's a bit of a road novel for her as she travels up from Florida to Massachusetts, where the last day of his experiment is where things kind of went awry. And the novel is pretty heavily influenced by like David Cronenberg and H.P. Lovecraft and Reanimator and that sort of thing. And it's less about like his experiment, but what the chain of events that he sort of sets into motion and the people that get sort of like embroiled in what comes out of his experiment, because of what he does, he gets the attention of a clandestine government agency, and his lab assistants were obviously like very, very closely involved with the experiment, there was a bit of an explosion, and people may or may not have been injured or killed in the explosion, but it jumps from place to place to place and follows these characters as they all sort of convene on where David Keating's, well, that's the scientist, is laying comatose in Mass General Hospital. And it's kind of strange, but when I started the novel in 2020, I had the idea for the scientist who does experimentation, and he ends up falling into a coma. Well, in the art measuring up to reality, whatever, I was actually in a coma for a week and a half last year. So it was a bit strange for me to be writing sort of about something that kind of like ended up happening to me. It was a bit ominous, but eventually I did finish it. And like I said, it's the first in a trilogy. This one's more of science fiction, like I said, like more along the lines of like a David Cronenberg Scanners type of deal. But the second novel, which I've started working on already, is more of a horror novel. And the third one I pretty much have planned out too. So yeah, I'll be busy doing these for the foreseeable future. And I had a really, really good time writing it. So I was happy to finally release it. It's my first novel. And I released it on my birthday last Friday. So hooray me.
Frank, let's dive a little bit deeper into your folks with whom we are traveling.
Well, the narrator of the first book, The Vicious Vintner, is Nick Williams, and the mysteries are named after him. He's kind of at the center of pretty much everything I write about. He's the first character I ever wrote, and he just ends up buying into a winery in Sonoma, and along the way, as things are developing, these people keep dying in different ways, and no one can ever quite figure out what exactly is going on until things kind of come together. Different people show up. And one of the things I did with this story in particular, and it's kind of part of Nick's progression, is to get him out of feeling like he is tied to being a private investigator, and so that he can do more things. And that's been this whole theme of the 70s for him. And so I had 6 novels prior to this that were set in 71 and 72. And this one, I've got the years wrong. They were set in 70 and 71, and this book starts in 72. I keep forgetting. I keep pushing it ahead a year. And so with this book, he is basically, book previous to this, he and Carter, his husband, ended up in Big Sur, and they did this little ceremony where they burned their paper licenses, their private investigator licenses. And Carter was like, I just hope the universe gets this message that no more dead bodies. And so then in this story, they run across like 5 dead bodies. But the private investigating happens over a period of 11 years. And in the deepening of the story, Nick finds out more and more and more about why he is the person he is and where his wealth came from, because that has always been kind of a mystery. I mean, everybody knew where it came from ostensibly, but why it was given to him is now revealed, and who was involved with that. So that's The Vicious Vintner. And the very end of it, there's one thing I kind of want to throw in here. At the very end of the story, there's a scene that happens in Paris in a hospital room. And the 4 characters who are standing around the bed of the being with the person who's dying, were all doing something similar 23 years before that in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And the person who was dying then, nobody knew, but he was basically dying of AIDS. And because he had been living in Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa in the Congo, which is kind of where the theory is that that's where AIDS came from, or kind of upriver from there. So they have this repeat of that scene where the 4 of them are standing around this bed, and they know this person is dying of AIDS. And one of the women who's standing there is kind of gets a little, like, not really hysterical. She's British, so she doesn't get hysterical, but she gets a little bit overwrought and wants to kind of like go to every doctor and say, we've seen this before. We saw this 23 years ago. This is really important, and I don't know why. And they're all like, look, we're just trying to deal with this shit. Like, We don't care where it came from. We're just trying to keep people alive and do the best we can. So that'll play out eventually in these stories. But it was fun is not really the right word, but I really enjoyed revisiting that idea because I knew there was going to be a scene like this when I wrote that book that was set in 1960, where they have the first bedside scene. Okay, so that's the Nick Williams Mysteries. The contemporary series that's also part of this is the Romantical Adventures of Whit and Eddie, and Eddie is the primary character. He's the narrator. He's the Nick of those stories. And in this, he suddenly realizes that they own, because he and Carter have he and Whit have inherited Nick and Carter's big business. And as things happen with really large companies, you kind of lose things occasionally. And they kind of lost these wineries, and they didn't realize they owned them. But then an event occurs where it becomes clear that they do, and that sends them back to Burgundy, to the same part of France where part of this story happened before. And it's kind of a repeat of some of the things that happened, but now it is even going deeper. And Eddie gets to be sitting at the center of being able to pull together things that even Nick and Carter never knew about, that really brings the story home. And I really love moving back and forth in time, because there's a lot of that going on here, and going back and forth in terms of who knows what and how the pieces come together. It's one of my favorite things about doing in-universe stories that cross each other. And I've done this before with also the same contemporary series where they go back and they help solve a murder that happened in the 40s that had been written about in a different series. So anyway, that's what's going on here. So it basically is this deepening. And I also, one last thing, I feel like, because I don't really write these books, I just dictate them, but I feel like I said before, with Nick and Carter, this is the end of their middle age. So they're moving into their elder years, and it's going to turn to be very Murder, She Wrote. And it'll get a lot lighter and easier, because there have been some heavy topics in these last few books. But also with Whit and Eddie, there's something also changing there, and I'm not quite sure what it is. So I can't wait to find the next book to see what happens. But that's who these people are that are part of these stories. So
there's a lot of stuff stacked up here again in those to be read piles. So and there's a whole lot of work that's gone for all these books. So one of my favorite things is always what'd you learn? What'd you discover? What rabbit hole did you trip over? What surprised you in the work, right? Because there's a whole lot of different things going on here. So Kim, what'd you learn? What surprised you? What, especially as you're going into a new shared world full of carnivals?
There was tons of things. I mean, I had to dip back into the Greek tragedies that they made me read back in college. And, I've reread some of them over the years, and I had to remember that. I had to do a lot of research on the 1980s. I was around in the 1980s, but suddenly it's historical fiction, and there's some scenes that take place in Portland, Oregon. And I lived there at that time. But, trying to remember things like, what was the name of the Greek restaurant in the Galleria shopping mall, that kind of thing. So that was really fun. And I had to draw on a lot of friends and family. But one of the things that was the most fun is I ended up doing a lot of research on birds, on the corvid family. The name of the book is Crow's Fate, and corvids of various species play a part in the story. So I did a lot of research on crows and jays and ravens and the other birds in that family. And then I started, because, as you do, I started watching the ones in my backyard, and so I started putting peanuts out for the birds. And mainly what we get is a lot of scrub jays. So now I've become totally fascinated. I can watch the backyard as I'm writing. So as I'm sitting at my laptop, behind it is where I can see the birds. And I've become totally fascinated with this whole life going on with the scrub jays, and it's kind of distracting. It keeps my cat occupied, though, so that's good. But now I know more factoids about corvids than anybody probably ever wanted to know, but it's been really fascinating.
All right, Joshua, what rabbit hole did you trip over editing? What, was there something about adding in the extra anthology? Was it cranking out the new magazine this year? Was it just something from a story for you?
Well, I was going to talk about the when we pick a. I'll do with the themes first. The themed anthologies first. When we pick a theme, we want to pick a theme that has a lot of variety. So when I'm thinking about what themes to use, I always ask myself, okay, if I had to write a story for this theme, like what could I come up with? And if I can only come up with like one or two ideas for that theme, then I feel like there's nothing there, right? It's not a good theme. But if I can sit down and come up with like 5, 6, 7, right off the top of my head, stories that will fit that particular theme, then I figure that's a pretty strong theme, that we're going to get some variety. We're going to get some different kinds of stories, because I hate reading. They're out there, but I hate reading them. Those themed anthologies where every story basically sounds exactly the same. So I want my variety, and what I find surprising pretty much every single time is that, I jotted down 6, 7 ideas for this theme, and in the end, we end up with none of them in the actual theme, because people are so creative that they can come up with these, completely different ideas, totally different ideas than anything that I thought of, and we still end up with a really, really strong anthology. So I just find that surprising every single time that the 7 stories I would have written for this particular theme, those ideas never seem to pop up. So I always find that interesting. But you're right. This last year, the biggest thing I learned was the difference between a themed anthology open call and a totally blank open call. Because you get a ton of additional stories. So you get, because anything goes basically. And then also just the variety. Any genre was open. Obviously we had some things we didn't want, like, the standard, like no gratuitous violence and, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. But otherwise it was pretty much open, and just the difference between reading for a magazine versus reading for a themed anthology. Because you can, for a themed anthology, you can start the story and, partway through you can say, I don't think this is going to be themed. And then you can ditch it, right? You can't do that for the magazine because everything's themed. So you end up reading a lot of the stories, and I ended up with a much longer potential list than I would for a themed anthology, because I was like, hey, that's a really good story, and I really like that concept and whatnot. So it was a lot harder to narrow down the stories that I could accept for the open call for the magazine. So very interesting. I've run a small press for 10 years, and good luck, Keith, with with your new small press, because you do have to be a little bit insane in order to start up a small press. But the fact that even after 10 years, I'm like totally learning new things by starting up this magazine.
Wally, what'd you learn?
Well, this being my first actual novel that I've finished and published, and I'm 3 years away from turning 50. Over the years, I've tried to, or made attempts at writing novels before, and I've set out this is going to be my novel, and this is going to be such a great idea, and I know the whole story, and so on and so on and so forth. And I never ended up finishing any of them. They just sort of the ideas went by the wayside. But for this story, it didn't start off as a novel. It just started off as the short story with our scientist who's trying to fix himself, and then goes awry and so on. And then I would think of another idea, and it sort of followed along with the story, and it kind of, before I knew it, it was writing itself. So I have to marvel at the irony of starting a story and deciding that it's going to be a short story at the beginning, and then it ends up being the first novel that I ever really finished. Whereas, like, I had tried, like, 8, 9, 10 times before when I was younger to write a novel, and it never really finished because that's what I started off trying to do. So it started off small, and then it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's my first novel, and now it's a trilogy. So the idea just seems to keep writing itself. So I'm just kind of going along for the ride, and then, I mean, it's come a lot easier to me for whatever reason. Maybe it's because I relate with the character that kind of kicks the events off a little bit. But when you start thinking of characters as less, inventions that you put on a piece of paper or in a paragraph or in a chapter, and you start thinking about them more as real people, I think that it gets a lot easier to write about them because you start to get to know them a little bit, I guess, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's that's kind of the thing I learned was, don't try to start off writing a novel. Write a short story first, I guess. So.
Right? Let me guess. It has to do with wine country. Oh, wait.
Well, somewhat, yeah. But before I say anything, I just wanted to congratulate Wally because I started when I was 49. I'm working on books 95 and 96 right now, and I'm only 56. So
I'm doomed.
Yeah, no, you can do it. So you've got 3 years ahead of me.
Thank you.
I did the same thing. I had like 4 or 5 or 6 different books that I tried to write over the first all my adult life, and then just all of a sudden it clicked. So
yeah.
So congratulations. Yeah. Anyway, so a couple of things that I learned. One was about wine. I created a varietal because I couldn't figure out what else to do. That I wanted to make it as exotic as I could, and so it's Moravian Rhine Valley hybrids. They're developed in the 20s and 30s, and but in Sonoma, and it ends up producing, after about 40 years, the varietal is called Breaklaw, which I don't know where I get that word from. It came from somewhere, and I can't find my notes as to why I came up with that name. But I love the name. I'm like, I'm going to make a wine called Breaklaw. And later on, the original vintner, his granddaughter, creates a new wine called the New Breaklaw, which is basically an American version of Beaujolais Nouveau. But it comes out before Americans really know what Beaujolais Nouveau is. So you may not even know what it is. If you're not an East Coast person, you probably don't. But that was a lot of fun, trying to figure out how that works and how it would come together and what's involved. I don't do anything with wine making. I just talk about grapes mostly. So that was one thing. That was a lot of fun. The other thing that I stumbled across, because the characters it's 1975. They're on a boat. They're sailing in the San Francisco Bay, and they need to go have lunch in Sausalito. So I was looking for a restaurant for them to go eat in Sausalito, paging through the old phone books and looking at the old newspapers, and I came across this thing that, as soon as I found it, I was like, how in the world have I never heard of this woman? And I'm going to get her last name wrong, but her first name was Sally, and I think her last name is Staunton. She was the mayor of, the last thing she did before she passed away was she was the mayor of Sausalito. She'd been on the city council in the 70s. But prior to that, she was a madam in San Francisco and owned like a network of houses and was constantly getting in trouble. And she got in trouble with the war ration board for overcharging rent and went to jail for 30 days in federal jail. And because she wouldn't lower her rent, and they just got really mad at her. Everybody else was having to do that. So she was quite a character. And so I developed this story around her, and it's just it's not very long, but I spent a long time researching her. I literally found every reference in the San Francisco papers to her, and like basically did a timeline of when she arrived to the time she died. Interestingly, there was a made-for-TV movie about her that came out in '77 that starred Diane Cannon, who played Sally, which is interesting because Diane Cannon was the last wife of Cary Grant, who is a character throughout all my books. He's constantly showing up because he's not really out of the closet, and but nobody really knows, and there's this whole thing about that. Along with his best buddy Randy Scott, who's always by his side, along with Randy's long-suffering wife, they kind of travel together, which apparently did actually happen in real life. So I went down all those little rabbit holes, but my favorite thing was just finding because I've written historical fiction about gay characters, particularly in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and so I'm accustomed to reading newspaper articles that don't talk about lots of things, but actually make it possible for you to understand what they're actually talking about without explicitly saying anything. And the same thing was true here, because there were all these things that they couldn't say about who she was and what she was doing. But after a while, I began to realize there was a code that they were using over and over again, that went on for 20 years. Everybody in San Francisco would have known who she was. As soon as her name shows up, they're like, oh, it's that woman who owns that house of ill repute, but not just one, several. This woman was really wealthy. She was awesome. And I really wish I'd gotten to meet her in real life, but she died before I ever moved to San Francisco. So those were my rabbit holes. A lot of fun.
All right, Keith, how about you?
I actually have for each of these three projects, I've got something. For the four Huzuma Juggers of the Apocalypse, it was more. Joshua touched on this a little bit. The nightmare that is creating a small press, in particular, just all the paperwork. God. Also, a word of advice for everyone: if you're setting up an LLC, do not use LegalZoom as your registered agent. That's all I'm going to say about that. So that has been an ongoing nightmare. That we're finally almost done with, which is why the book is finally coming out 2 years after we did the Kickstarter. For the Sherlock Holmes story, the thing that got me was sitting down and actually writing it and realizing just how much fun Sherlock Holmes is to write. My biggest concern was getting into his voice, and not so much getting into his head, because you're in Watson's head, really, because Watson's narrating. Excuse me, but getting into his voice was really easy. It helped that I was basically doing Jeremy Brett, but still, he turned out to be a tremendously fun character to write. And I was really just grooving on his voice and his mannerisms and his mode of speaking and his very direct nature. It was great. And that was tremendous fun. For Double Trouble, the cool thing for me in that, and the thing that I really enjoyed digging into as one of the two editors on the book, was learning about all of these different characters. A lot of the writers took fairly well-known characters, the ones I mentioned, like Prospero, Don Quixote, Lydia Bennett, Frankenstein's monster, and so on. Derek Tyler Attico combined Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, and John Henry, which was a wonderfully bizarre combination. And Jennifer Brody put together Abraham Van Helsing from Dracula with the Medusa from Greek mythology. So those are all things that people might have heard of. But some people took some more obscure characters. Maurice Broadus, for example, paired together two Harlem Renaissance era characters, one from comics from the night and one from literature. Ace Harlem, detective who appeared in a 1947 comic called All Negro Comics, and the title character from a novel called The Conjure Man Dies. These were both African-American characters from Harlem, And James Moore took a couple of old pulp characters, the Moon Man and the Man in the Black Cloak, the latter of whom was pretty much the Shadow, except he predated the Shadow by about 20 years. But he's pretty much got the same MO and like the same look, the same everything as the Shadow. And one wonders about plagiarism at this point. But what else? There were a bunch of other, really wonderfully obscure characters. That was the other one. Dayton Ward took two comic book characters from the World War II era, Captain Battle and Blackout. Captain Battle appeared in all of 4 comic books, but he was a World War I veteran who was basically trying very hard to prevent a second war from happening, which obviously didn't work out for him. But he had all sorts of like funky technology that he put to use in trying to prevent another war. And Blackout is a scientist whose village was bombed. He basically had the Flash's origin. His village was bombed by the Nazis, and he was a chemist, and the chemicals he was working with interacted with the air, so it turned his entire body black, and he could manipulate black forces and stuff like that. It's a very 1940s origin. But these were all characters that I was not familiar with until I edited this anthology, and not getting to learn more about them, not just from the stories, but also that led me to doing more research about them and finding out more about them, partly for my own benefit and partly so I could edit the stories better as well. So that was really cool.
Well, everybody's got a lot of stuff to stack up in those to be read piles. But before we get out of here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys as well as all of these books. So, Frank, you're up first.
My books are wide, so Amazon and pretty much everywhere else that books are sold. You can find me at frankwbutterfield.com. I'm on Facebook, but I'm not really on the socials that much anymore. So my website's the best place to find me, or just Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you want to go.
Keith?
If you just do a Google search for Keith DeCandido, I am literally the only one who will turn up. My website is at decandido.net, but it's terrible. One of these days, I'm really going to drag it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. However, it is, if nothing else, useful as a link dump for where else to find me online. I have a blog because I'm old. And I'm on Facebook. I am still on Twitter, at least for the time being. And I'm on Instagram. I update my blog regularly. I have a Patreon where I do lots of interesting things. At least I hope they're interesting. I also have a YouTube channel where once a month I read one of my short stories. It's something I started during the recent apocalypse and have continued doing. Any of those places. And my books are available from pretty much whatever your online book dealer of choice is.
Kim?
So I'm Kay Fielding Writes pretty much across the board. So kayfieldingwrites.com is my website, and I'm on most of the social medias, including Against My Will, TikTok. I'm way too old for TikTok, but there I am. And the book itself, So Crow's Fate, right now it's just on Amazon, but it is also out on audio. So it's out on print, ebook, audio, and it's on Kindle Unlimited, at least for the time being.
Joshua?
For the books, ZNB Presents Year 1 is an ebook and trade paperback. Ebooks pretty much everywhere at this point, the main sources anyway at the moment. Trade paperback on Amazon, and you can find all of them at the Zombies Need Brains website, which is zombiesneedbrains.com. For the magazine, again, like I said earlier, we need subscribers, so find us on Patreon. And all you have to do is go there and search Zombies Need Brains, and it should pop right up. In terms of the themed anthologies and whatnot, you can find us at zombiesneedbrains.com. You can find my stuff at joshuapalmatier.com. We're on Facebook and Twitter as long as it remains alive. And And we will be running a new Kickstarter starting August 15th for 3 brand new anthologies. So keep an eye out for that, and you can support the small press and the themed anthologies that way as well.
Wally?
Yep. So the unblurred version of my book, there it is, the Ascendant Hierophant Trilogy, Book 1. I write under W.P. Quigley, and you can find me on Amazon. You purchase your books online, and my online presence is at ascendantpublishing.com. So you can find the book there, plus Double Feature Magazine and a bunch of other stuff there too. So that's where you'll find me online. Instagram and on the regular pedestrian internet.
And I've been your host tonight, Jim Nettles, and you can find me at jamesgnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, speculative-fiction-academy.com, creatingprose.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we'll see you guys again soon. Go stack up those to-be-read piles, and don't let this one fall on top of you.